Today's October 1st, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. A day or two ago, I posted a talk that I think is pretty significant, even though the title might not attract many Catholic parents. The title of the talk was Religious Freedom and Family Religion. After I posted the talk, I thought to myself that I probably should have titled it Religious Freedom versus Family Religion. But I raised some issues in that talk that I think are really important for Catholic parents. And in this talk, in God's providence, today at Mass, the Gospel reading, I think really supports the message that I was trying to share in that talk. Because I think that as Catholics living today in the 21st century in America, we spend our time reading books, learning about Catholic history, watching movies about different periods of Catholic history, and then we look at our circumstances and we feel like the sky is falling because it doesn't look like medieval Catholicism, it doesn't look like the lives of the saints and so on. We don't consider, though, the differences, the real significant political, economic, social, philosophical differences between the world we live in the 21st century and the world that many of the saints we learn about lived in. We don't compare apples with apples, and we end up judging our lives irrationally. I mean, just imagine, if there's one child who's born into a royal family who lives in a palace with dozens of servants and endless supplies of wealth, that person is going to have a very different life than a person who is born in poverty, who doesn't know if he's going to eat today. To sit there and pretend like they should have the same expectations every day when they wake up would be nuts. But that's what Catholics do today, who wake up in 21st century America and imagine that their life should look like the life of a Catholic family living in a different place and time. It's just an irrational worldview that many Catholics have. And so the reactions that they make to the experiences of their life, the conclusions they draw, and so on, are just unreasonable and false. And what's worse about it is these false interpretations of their own experiences lead them into all other kinds of problems, and it just sort of snowballs and gets worse and worse. For example, how many families, how many parents desiring to raise their children in the Catholic faith will begin by trying to make stricter rules and higher standards for devotion and piety, and by those stricter standards actually create all kinds of fights and end up having nasty fights with people, producing an environment that's even worse than if there was no religion at all. There are many Catholics who do things that are even worse than what unbelievers are doing. And they do it in the name of religion. And imagine that it's okay for them to be cursing or fighting with all their children or divorcing or whatever because they're so zealous for the faith. And you can go crazy thinking like that. We've got to learn to live in our circumstances with realistic expectations. I've talked about this 100 times in different contexts, but when it comes to parenting and family life, Catholic parents really aren't thinking about parenting and family life in light of the reality of our circumstances, which are adverse to Catholicism. Catholicism is not persecuted in our society. You're not going to get punished or attacked or beaten or imprisoned if you're a Catholic. But Catholicism is not promoted or supported by American society. And so we live in a unique set of circumstances, unique in world history, and we've got to learn to think about our situation realistically, or we're going to end up making even worse problems for ourselves and for our families. Now, in that talk I gave on religious freedom and family religion, I explained how this idea in America of religious freedom leads children to abandon their parents' religion. And I talked about how unreasonable that was. It really doesn't make sense, because this idea of religious freedom, which tells children that they have a right to choose their own religion, which is true, encourages them to begin that pursuit of their own religion by assuming that their parents' religion is false, and that is unreasonable. What I argued was that if children were reasonable, if children were prudent and not foolish, they would assume that their parents' religion was true until it was proven false. After all, they watch their parents' religion sustain the lives of their parents. They watch their parents' religion provide their parents with a happy marriage. They watch as their parents' religion provide guidance and direction for their parents' lives. They watch as their parents, moved by their religion, seek to live charitably, overcome difficulties by faith and perseverance, are happy in the presence of all kinds of negative experiences because of the grace of hope. They can see all the fruits of their parents' religion, and they should therefore assume their parents' religion to be true, unless it was demonstrated somehow to be false. Now, of course, if Catholic parents are not living lives that manifest those fruits of true religion, and many Catholic parents don't live devout lives, many of them have worse habits than unbelievers. You can look around and see lazy Catholic parents who barely work, don't earn enough money to provide for their family's needs. You can look and see intemperate Catholics, obese, don't take care of themselves. And try to imagine living as a child under those parents who are in many ways worse than unbelievers. It's going to be very hard to embrace the religion of those parents, and those parents are in trouble because they're actually providing the stumbling block for their children's spiritual lives, making them or encouraging them to doubt the Catholic religion. But I would hope that in many places, children were being raised by Catholic parents who were bearing the fruits of the Catholic life and giving their children a pleasant childhood, pleasant education, pleasant family life, and giving them an attractive view of Catholicism. And if, as I said, if the children are wise, they will intend to follow their parents in their family religion, unless somehow it was proven to them that their family religion was false, or that something better was available to them. But that's usually not what happens. Children are raised They have this American ideology pumped into their head from every angle at all times every day. And they're led to think that what they need to do in order to practice freedom of religion, they need to step away from their parents' life, step away from their parents' religion, step away from the church, step out from under their parents' roof, and sort of find themselves, to experiment with different religious ideas or philosophies, or no religion at all, and maybe just focus on what appear to them as they enter young adulthood to be the pressing or urgent concerns of their lives. Going to school, finding a partner, establishing a career, and so on. It's reasonable to see why a young adult would find those things to feel urgent and necessary at that point in their lives. But parents, as I said, misinterpret these events and act as if a child growing up in medieval France is rejecting the Catholic faith and joining the Muslims or something like that, or like a child in 17th century England is choosing to abandon the Catholic faith and join the Puritans in rebelling against King Charles, the Catholic king. The parents interpret the events in their children's lives, the decisions their children make, they interpret them unreasonably and falsely, not considering the different circumstances in which their children live in American society, as opposed to those other predominantly Catholic societies that were not democratic, societies that did not promote freedom of religion, societies that did not urge children to exercise their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in opposition to their parents if necessary. The society is very, very different, and children are given very great liberty in America. And when you read the lives of the saints, you're not reading about cultures where kids had to deal with that. It's an American thing. It's a modern democratic thing. These were radical ideas in the 1700s. And as Catholics, we tend to spend a lot of time reading saint biographies from very distant generations where Catholics were living in very different circumstances. In American society, for a young adult to choose to walk away from their family religion is really not a big deal. It's not what it would have been in medieval France or in Protestant England for a Catholic to choose to join the Protestants. That's not what it's like for an American 19-year-old to stop going to church, or to abandon religion, or to start studying other philosophies or other religions, get involved in political movements, and so on. It's not a big deal because in America, there's freedom and everyone is encouraged to make their own decisions. It's a very different culture. And it's not a rejection of the parents' faith. It's more like a beginning of one's own investigation in questions of life and religion and philosophy and so on. And it's just a necessary part of American life. Now, today's gospel reading, as I said, gives us an insight that I think is helpful in thinking about our circumstances reasonably. Jesus tells a parable of two sons. He said a man had two sons. He goes to one of his sons and he says, "Son, I'd like you to go out today and work in my vineyard." And the son says no. But then in time, he goes and works in the vineyard. And the father goes to a second son and says, "Son, I would like you to go work in my vineyard today." And the son says, "Yes, sir." But then he doesn't go. He ends up not working in the vineyard. So we've got two different sons. We've got a father who has a will that his sons, both of them, would go and work on the farm, let's say, for the day. And we can apply this to any modern situation, Go cut the grass. Go take out the garbage. Go do whatever. Go do your studies. And the two sons respond in two different ways. One says, "No, I don't want to." And the other says, "Yes, sir. Yes, Dad." And this is our experience with our children. We tell our children what we would like them to do. Remember, this is a parable. So when Jesus says in the parable, "Go and do this today," that's the parable. That's the illustration. But if you think about our lives, we spend our children's entire childhood teaching them what we would like them to do. We start with their earliest years of catechesis, training them to go to church, training them to say their prayers, teaching them how to correctly answer the catechism questions, teaching them to read the Bible, teaching them good manners, teaching them to take care of themselves, teaching them to respect others. We teach them our will, not at a moment in the morning like this father in the parable, but we teach them our will throughout their entire childhood. And when they come to this moment as they enter into adulthood, where they finally receive their independence legally, they respond to our instruction. Some of them say, "No, I will not." Some of them say, "Yes, I will." This parable warns us that this isn't that simple. It's not that simple. And what we often see parents having a nervous breakdown because they have a child who says, "No, I won't." A child who bucks against their teaching, bucks against their will, has his own plans, and so on. The parents melt down as if this, like I said, as if the sky is falling. And that opposition, that negative response, is interpreted as, quote unquote, children abandoning the faith, leaving the Catholic Church, and so on, because they say no. And the other children, the good little children, who look at mommy and daddy and say, "Oh, yes, mommy, I will go to a Catholic school. Yes, I will go to Mass on Sunday. Yes, I will." They're often celebrated and praised because they respond positively to their parents' wishes. But the parable warns us that it's not so simple. It's not so simple. Because these are just words. These are just words, and we know that talk is cheap. Every one of us knows, every one of us has gotten ourselves in trouble by trying to be friendly or trying to be nice and agreeing to do something that we have absolutely no interest in doing, and then we kick ourselves and try to figure out how we can get ourselves out of this thing that we said we would do. We said, "Yes, we will come to the party," or "Yes, we will come over and watch the game at your house." And we have no interest in doing this, but we said yes. We know what it's like to say something but not mean it, to give a positive response but actually in our hearts have a negative response. And what we do usually is we work to find a way out of that positive response over time. Not necessarily dishonestly, but usually we do have other things to do. We do have priorities to attend to, and we really shouldn't do those things. But it's easy to say yes. It's easy to be a yes man and just always respond with a smile and with assent to anything spoken to us. When children do that, we often interpret it positively when we know from our own experience it's possible to do that and actually not mean it. And Jesus warns us of celebrating the kids that appear to say yes, the kids that appear to be good boys and girls. Because even though they say yes, they may not end up doing their parents' will. Because talk is cheap, and actions speak louder than words. At the same time, when a child hears his father's instructions or knows what his parents want him to do, enters into this independent time of life, he may respond with a negative response and say, no, I don't want to. I don't want to practice your religion. I don't want to go to your church. I don't want to do what you do. And the parents have a meltdown. Sometimes those situations turn into ugly, blown up fights between the parents and the children. Just think how stupid that is. I mean, you want to make an impression on the kid when the kid lives in a country where there's freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and so on, and you're going to try to clamp down more strictly on your children. You're going to fulfill every single warning those children hear about the concept of tyranny. And you're just going to make it easier and easier for your children in America to say, my parents are psychos. They think they have a right to control other people's religious beliefs. They think they have a right to control free people's lives. They're crazy. Their religion is crazy. They're like spiritual tyrants. Crazy people. They feel like they should be able to tell me where to go to school, who I can marry, what career I should pursue, how I should dress. They think that I'm like their slave and they're my master, and even though I'm an adult, they can tell me to do whatever they want. They're crazy people. And if you would go and read the catechism, you'll learn that the catechism is on the kids' side in that discussion. Because parents do not have the right to command the lives of their adult children. Children have the right to choose their own vocation or occupation. Children have the right to choose their own schooling. Children have the right to choose their own spouses. We're talking about adult children. And many parents refuse to accept that reality. Many parents are committed to treating their 20-year-old child as if he's 7 years old. And if he doesn't obey, they act like they're going to spank him or punish him in his room when he's an adult who should be moving to live independently, not only financially independently, but volitionally. That is, with respect to his will, he should be moving to live independently. And many parents try to keep their young adult children as young children. And that's actually not Catholic parenting. But the negative response, the pushback from the children to say, Mom, Dad, get off my back. I don't even know if I want to be a Catholic. I don't even know if I want to go to your church. I don't know if I want to live the way you live. I don't even know if I want to get married. I don't know what I want to do. I want to go and find my own way. Most parents interpret that with exaggeration and begin thinking, my child has abandoned the faith. My child has chosen to reject the Catholic Church. And that's not true. That's not true. The child has not abandoned the faith. The child is beginning the process of choosing his own faith. Your desire should be to continually evangelize the child to make Catholicism the most attractive choice, because he's working to evaluate and learn about the different options. And this isn't necessarily an intellectual process. He's not necessarily going to college and majoring in world religion or philosophy to answer these questions. He may just be experimenting with different things, different groups of friends, different activities, and so on. It may not be the most noble means of pursuing knowledge of religion or choosing a lifestyle, but he's exercising some curiosity, looking into different options that he's not familiar with because he was kept from them as a child. And now that he's free, he wants to go check them out. He's got this curiosity. And I don't necessarily think that this is a bad thing because many of us came out of those things and became Christians. And so there's a difference between us and our children. Many of us have chosen to leave worldly things because we've already gotten bored with them. Many of us choose to leave worldly practices because we've already tested them and have experienced the dissatisfaction that they give. There are some who are sexually immoral and who date and have sex with tons of people and get sick of it. And then they turn to Christianity. They turn over a new leaf. They become good people. They become moral people. And they have children, and they imagine that their children now are going to live joyfully in celibacy because their experience, the parents' experience with sexual pleasure, was dissatisfying. And they've moved on from it. Where that's really not reasonable. The parent moved on from it because it was tried and found wanting. And you know what? The child may do the same thing. And I know that Catholic parents don't want to hear that, but it's hypocritical to think that it was okay for you to learn religion through your experience of sin. But if your children seek that same experience, they're in some condition that's worse than yours was. And the reality is the children are attracted to something that of course they shouldn't be attracted to, but they are. They're attracted to something, and this is where the parable of the prodigal son shows us what's going to happen. They're going to move away from the right way. And again, I'm not assuming that any parent's teaching is the right way. That's sort of a circular argument. This idea that any Catholic that has a child is all of a sudden a sound teacher and practitioner of the Catholic faith. That's not necessarily true. So I don't give this assumption that anything that a Catholic parent does or says is right. There are many kids who are taught all kinds of false ideas and shown terrible examples of how to live by parents who claim to be Catholics, who imagine themselves to be saints, but really have no idea what they're doing in life, and usually lack self-awareness to realize what the actual impact of their life is on those around them. So let's not give all the benefit of the doubt to the parents and assume that they're doing everything right, teaching everything accurately, and so on. There are many kids experiencing frustrating, irrational lessons and examples from their parents. That's one of the reasons why children do choose to leave the faith, because their parents actually make it suspicious. Their parents don't allow them to trust it. And so they've got to go and test the waters on their own. You may have grown up watching all kinds of worldly movies, maybe playing sports, hanging out with all kinds of kids, goofing around, going to clubs and parties, watching movies and listening to music, all kinds of worldly indulgence of every desire and pleasure. And then after a while, you just realized, this is really empty. This is really not satisfying. And it was at that point that you began to look into religion. Now, meanwhile, you've got children who are sitting, looking out at the world filled with all of these flashing lights, all this baubles and bric-a-brac, as John Bunyan called it. And they're curious. They're wondering what it feels like to ride on a roller coaster. They're wondering what it's like to be able to just browse through playlists of secular music, which sounds really cool. They're wondering what it's like to do this, or play this sport, or participate in this group, or dress in this way, and so on. And now that they've got this American independence at age 18, they want to go test it out. And I really don't think that it's reasonable for us to interpret their pursuit of this curiosity as some kind of intentional, deliberate, thoughtful rejection of the Catholic faith. I think that's exaggerating what's actually going on. They're putting the Catholic faith to the test. They're checking out other things. It's like if, let me give an illustration. Let's say that I want to buy a car, and my father said to me, look, our family buys Fords. Your great-grandfather had a Ford, your grandfather had a Ford, your father and all your uncles drive Fords. We're a Ford family. You need to go buy a Ford. And you think to yourself and say, no, I don't need to buy a Ford. It doesn't matter that my grandparents or my father and uncles drove Ford. I can go buy whatever car I want. I'm paying for the car after all, and it's got to serve my needs. So, yeah, you know what? It's true. You grew up, and everywhere you went, every time you did anything, you were driven around in a Ford. And you've really got no reason to criticize Fords. You've got nothing negative to say about Fords. But there are other options. You know, you've seen those Toyota trucks. They're pretty cool. The Dodge trucks are pretty nice. Maybe you don't even want a truck. Maybe you would like a car. Maybe you'd like an SUV. So what do? You go to the dealers and you start checking things out. You look at different options. You learn about different kinds of cars and trucks. You take some for test drives. And you may continue that process for months and months. And you can imagine your miserable father wringing his hands at home as he hears about you visiting the Subaru dealer and test driving a Volkswagen or looking at the Chevy trucks, but you really haven't committed to anything yet. Is there anything wrong with checking out the options? Well, it may be a waste of time, and your father's advice may actually be the best advice, and you may have been best off had you just listened to your father and went straight to the Ford dealership and bought a Ford. That might have been the best option in the end, but it also might not have been the best option in the end. Because if you were questioning whether another option might be better, you might go and buy that Ford because that's what your dad said to do, and your dad might be pleased, might pat you on the back and say, "I'm glad you made that decision." But there is a problem with that decision, and it's that you're going to go on thinking, man, I really wonder if I would have been happier had I got a Chevy, or had I got a little SUV or something else. And you're going to have that unsettled, uncertain wondering in the back of your head. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, what often happens is the person who doesn't just accept the advice or doesn't just obey the command, but goes out and checks out all of his options, he wastes a lot of time. He loses a lot of money. He suffers many bad experiences. But often what happens is he comes back around to that first position, to the position that was recommended to him at first, and he says, you know what, I've checked out some of these other options. I thought this was like this, and it turned out to be like this. I thought this would offer me this, and it turned out to do this. I think I am going to stick with this first option, the option that was recommended to me. And because of my experiences, I know why I'm sticking with this first option. And that choice to stick with the first option becomes a settled and convinced choice. And so the child who said yes and just did what he was told may do what pleases his father at first, but he may be haunted by this constant wondering or this attraction to other options for years to come, maybe through his entire life. Whereas that other child who said no, pushed back, went and tested the waters, may come back around and settle into that original position with a conviction and certainty that's infinitely valuable. And we see this in many lives of the saints. The most famous one is always St. Augustine. When St. Augustine finally came around, he came around for good. And his experience, his torment, his emotional and we could say psychological suffering that he describes made him the best of Catholics. And if we were to go and ask Monica and say, Saint Monica, what would you have rathered? Would you have rathered that your son followed your advice and became a Catholic when he was a young man? Or would you have rathered that your son wandered for a while, explored other religious views, other philosophies, messed around with the pleasures of the flesh, but then came and settled into Catholicism and became a famous bishop, a famous teacher and defender of the faith, and ultimately a canonized saint. I am pretty sure that Saint Monica would say, I wouldn't change a thing. God's ways are not my ways. And, I've shared this before because I think I heard it from one of my own teachers who said, God gave to Monica not what she asked for, but what she wanted. And so you can imagine Monica praying when her son Augustine was young. I'm sorry if I say Augustine and Augustine. In academic circles, it's usually pronounced Augustine, and in religious circles, it's usually pronounced Augustine. Monica had in mind what she wanted, and she asked God for certain things, and God did not give her what she asked for, and she was frustrated, famously frustrated. She complained to St. Ambrose. God did not give Monica what she asked for. God gave Monica a son who looked at her and said no. But God gave to Monica, in the end, what she wanted. God gave to Monica a son who did what she wanted in the end, but not in the way that she wanted it. And it turned out to be better than she could have imagined. The outcome of her teaching, the outcome of her example, the outcome of her prayers was instrumental in producing a result that was infinitely greater than she could have imagined, greater than anything she ever asked for. And she is memorialized for us today in the Confessions. Not because her appeals were received and obeyed by Augustine, but for the opposite reason, because he rejected her appeals and he disobeyed her teaching and watched as she loved him patiently for years and years and suffered on account of his choices. And when he was finally led back to the Catholic Church, or really for his sake, from his perspective, for the first time to the Catholic Church, it was in a completely different context. It was in a context where he had watched a holy saint love him and pray for him and bear with his decisions. And the mercy that he observed in his mother, he understood was only an overflow of the mercy that God himself was extending to Augustine. And that experience became part of the conversion experience that broke him and made him the most humble and most merciful and most patient of saints. Think about Saint Augustine is famous as the Doctor of Grace. I think that might be a title he's given, the Doctor of Grace. He taught, for example, the Church's doctrine of prevenient grace. That is the doctrine that God's grace actually works in us before we respond. There were other saintly men like John Cassian who taught that that's not how it worked, but that we have to act first and then God responds to us, because There's a passage in the New Testament that says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. And so some Catholics taught that the work of salvation begins when you take the first step towards God, and then God responds to you. And Augustine said, no, that's not how salvation works. It's already God's grace at work in you that leads you to take that first step. And this is called prevenient grace. So we can see how this experience from a son who said no to his mother turns out to be the greatest yes in the end. And this in the Christian life is normal. This is normal in the Christian life. Jesus himself said, those who are forgiven much love much. It's not the squeaky clean kid who always yeses mom and dad. It's not the kid at church who's always buttoned and polished that ends up becoming the saint in most cases. If you look around at the most influential Catholics in our society, you'll very often find that they're converts or reverts. It's very rarely a straight line from childhood in a Catholic family to a devout Catholic adulthood. It's very rarely a nice straight line. Even sometimes it may look like, from the outside, when you look at other people, it may look like it was a straight line, but you're not aware of the struggles that went on behind the scenes, struggles in private. Some people's struggles are wild and become visible, even to outsiders. Other people's struggles are more private, known only to the family. But it's not a straight line. This is one of the dangers of biographies. It's not a straight line from the beginning to the end. And in our lives, we go through the ups and downs with our children, with our friends, with our neighbors, and so on. We go through those ups and downs, and we feel like something strange is happening to us. And it's not. We live in a country that grants us religious freedom, and that brings with it a certain danger, because freedom is dangerous. Freedom is dangerous. Many parents really struggle with this idea of freedom. For example, your 8-year-old child comes to you and says, "Hey, Mom, is it okay if I get my bike and go ride down the road?" And you say, "Well, it's okay. It's all right. Go ahead." The kid asks, "Can I get my bike and ride down the road?" And the mother's like, "Oh, I don't know. There's cars on the road and it's dangerous. I don't know if And because there's a risk, the parent says, no riding your bike on the road because there's a risk that you might get hit by a car. And yet we look and we see other kids riding their bikes on the road. And the mother says, "Yeah, well, I don't care if there's other kids riding their bikes on the road. They're all stupid." And we know that that's really not how life works. There are always risks. There are always potential dangers. There's potential danger driving to the grocery store. There's potential danger walking down the steps. If we really were to take that principle and apply it consistently everywhere, we wouldn't move. And that's not a human life. And many parents simply don't want to have to face any risk. But what they don't think about is how rewards relate to risks that are taken. Every risk has to be weighed against its potential rewards. And this is a very difficult thing to think about. Imagine Christopher Columbus setting out across the ocean That's a pretty great risk. Why did he do it? Well, because he had reason to believe that there would be a great reward and that the risk was worth it. He didn't sit there and plot out his life and said, which way of life is risk-free? Because that's just not a human life. He could have chosen a risk-free option, but he knew that the risk-free option would bring no reward. And therefore, when he looked at the risk option, he said, yeah, but, man, what if? What if? What's really the purpose of life? To just preserve myself? What if? What if I could discover a passage to the west, or to the east, I should say? What if I could find a way across the ocean? It would change life for my European brothers and sisters forever. It would change life for my Christian friends forever. They wouldn't need to travel through enemy territories to trade with the East. They could go directly across the ocean and access the East without any interference. This risk of mine would bring life-changing benefits to my friends. I'm going to do it. And he chose the risk. And we tell our kids story after story after story, celebrating all of the people through history who took great risks. And they did so in hope of great rewards. And then when it's our turn to choose, no risks. No risks. And consequently, there's no rewards. I'll give you another illustration in the life of David. When David was a boy in the Old Testament, David's father was Jesse. He had 8 sons. David was the youngest of the sons. The father needed someone to watch the sheep that the family owned. And so he sent young David out to watch the sheep. Now that may seem simple at first, but we're not talking about an American farm. We're not talking about a fenced-in pasture. We're talking about 1000 BC shepherding in the Middle East. The sheep are not kept in a private pasture, but they're led out into the wilderness. And out in the wilderness, there could be bears, there could be wolves, there could be lions, I suppose, depending on where you are. And so, sending your son out with the sheep was a great risk. After all, why do the sheep need to be protected in the first place? Because there's deadly predators out there. Oh, okay, well, send the boy. Well, that's pretty crazy. That's very risky. Send the son to protect the sheep? Why would anyone do that? Because of the reward. And the reward was not necessarily that the sheep would be increased or that the family would become wealthier. The reward was the training that the son would receive in virtue. The work of shepherding would train David, the young son, in virtue. Where were David's older brothers? Why weren't they sent out to take care of the sheep? Because they were at war. They were living as a family in real life. The sons don't grow up to lay on a beach. The sons don't grow up to sit on a recliner. The sons grow up to defend our country in war. And the children need to be raised for that reality. The reward of having David go keep the sheep in the wilderness was that it would train him in virtue. When David faces Goliath, none of the men of the army of Israel are willing to step up and take on Goliath, who's challenged Israel to a one-on-one combat. Winner take all. None of the Israelites are willing to accept the challenge, but David does. And why does David accept the challenge? We get the usual silly Sunday school story. Oh, because David loved God. David believed in God. Well, yeah, that's part of it, but that's not the whole story. And the Holy Spirit didn't have that be the whole story. David says to Saul, I'm not afraid of this soldier. I'm not afraid of Goliath. And let me tell you why I'm not afraid. I shepherd my father's sheep. There have been days where I've had to fight off a wolf. There have been days where I've had to fight off a bear. And this Philistine champion, he's just like one of them. He may be stronger, more cunning. He may have more deadly arms than they did. But they were stronger than me too. And I was able to defeat them because God delivered them into my hands. And so we see the reward that was gained through the risk of having David shepherd the sheep. The reward was that he became courageous, truly courageous. Not reckless, not audacious, truly courageous. Courageous in a balanced and proper way. And David went out and took out Goliath. And the Holy Spirit tells us that David's confidence was not just some Sunday school answer because he believed in God. No, it was more than that. It was incarnate. It was real life. David learned that courage. David developed that faith by living in the presence of risks. Risks that his father sent him out to experience. And those risks brought reward. And this brings us back to the original question. Is it not possible? Is it not possible? I could even say, is it not common that young adults leave home where everything is safe and go out into the wilderness like David and learn to fight against wolves and bears? And you could say, yeah, but then this person, this happened, and yeah, but what's the end result? You're taking a snapshot of the fight. You're taking a snapshot of the fight. The end result reveals the truth about the experience, and for many, many people, it's very common that they are raised in a Catholic environment. They come to the age of independence. They choose to walk out into the world on their own. They choose to seek out some experiences of their own. The parents melt down unreasonably because they want their children to live a risk-free life, even though they don't live that way, or hopefully they don't live that way themselves. The children wander off into the wilderness, mess around with the wolves and the bears, have some real hand-to-hand experience with these things, learn about them, come away unimpressed, and return back to the family religion. Now, if you believe that Catholicism is actually true, if you believe that, if you believe that Catholicism is true, you claim that, well, then you believe that Catholicism would be the greatest and strongest warrior of all. Who's going to defeat him? Who's going to defeat Catholicism? Is someone going to prove Catholicism wrong? No. No one's going to prove Catholicism wrong anywhere, ever. Is someone going to physically overpower Catholicism? No, it's impossible. It'll never happen. Now, there may be a fight, there may be a battle. The child may fall at one point. The enemy may appear to have an upper hand, but the enemy is not going to win. The child is going to finally come to realize that this opponent is weaker, insufficient, inferior in every way, and ultimately unsatisfying. And this experience is very common. This was my experience personally. And when that person who has wandered for a bit comes back, they come back different. They come back settled. They come back confident. They come back ready to really dig in. And it's much, much better for them to come back settled than to have originally stayed uncertain. Now, no parent would desire that, and that's to some degree understandable, but it's just not how the spiritual life works. We talk about having free will, and yet it's as if we try to destroy free will in the next breath. What I want for my children, because I have experienced the world, I know what the world has to offer, I've tasted it, and I chose to walk away from it by God's grace, but also because I knew that it had nothing satisfying to offer. And when I walked away from it, I walked away from it once and for all. And I never looked back. And if I'm honest, not worried about what other people think or what other people say, other stupid busybodies getting into other family business, when I think honestly about my own kids, and I think of the question I asked before about Monica, would I rather have kids who say yes, but doubt their whole life, or are uncertain, or are uncommitted? Or if I would rather have kids who say no, and go out and put the family religion to the test, and come back settled, ready to dig in, and never look back, there's no question in my mind that I would not rather have my kids be settled, even if it required all kinds of suffering and humiliation. I want my kids to be settled. And if going out into the world and testing the waters is the means by which they come to be settled, I'm willing to walk that journey with them. I'm willing to go through that with them. I don't care what anybody else says. I don't care about the busybodies, judging by appearances, praising the nerdy little polished kid who chooses to stay home. I don't care. I'm concerned with the war, not just today's fight. And what we see in the gospel reading today is just this. The son who looked at his father and said no turned out to be the good boy. The son, the little polished, squeaky clean kid who always responds with a smile, "Yes, Daddy," that kid didn't do anything. Never did his father's will, didn't go out into the field. That smiley yes is fake. The kid who said no, at the end of the day, was the kid who got a handshake and thank you from his father. And I've learned through my experience as a teacher that this is how life often works. When I was a school teacher, there were usually 3 different kinds of students. There were the kids who got good grades. They were like the teacher's pets. They were the yes kids. Usually mom and dad were hovering over them like hawks all the time. And these kids got credit for all kinds of achievements that I would argue were really the achievements of their parents and not their own. I never liked those students because I always found that they really didn't like learning. They were just so supported and pushed along by their parents that they had an appearance of being quote-unquote smart. And then there was another group of kids who were neglected by their parents and who just didn't care about school, weren't going to do anything. But then there was a middle group of students. They were usually kids who were playing sports. They were usually the more popular kids. They were usually the kids who were borderline in trouble. They were the kids making the funny jokes in class, sometimes a little too crude, but genuinely humorous. And you can see that these kids, they weren't interested in some stuffy religion. They had parents that gave them freedom and challenged them to prove themselves worthy of trust. They were kids who took upon themselves challenges and risks. Like I said, most of them are usually athletes, and they get used to the pressure of sports, the injuries from sports, the challenges that sports place on their schedule and things like that. And they learn to operate under stress independently. Those are the kids that most of the teachers that I worked with didn't like. Most of the teachers that I worked with liked the goody two-shoe kids, the yes kids. But I didn't like them. I liked this other group of kids. And when I follow those kids into adult life, I find that those goody two-shoe kids often don't turn out to be much. They don't do much. They don't take upon themselves great projects. They don't pursue virtuous activities in adult life. They just continue to be yes kids throughout their lives. But the kids who usually go on and do honorable things are the kids who were the ones who were sort of on the edge, independent, got themselves into trouble, but at the same time did their studies, got their work done, could shift gears into a serious conversation, were courageous. If they believed something, if they had an opinion, they were willing to step up and defend it, not giggle away in the corner. And they become the kids who really do significant things as adults. And they cultivated that toughness and independence and courage as kids, and it often got them in trouble, but it wasn't a serious kind of trouble. It was just a part of growth in virtue. And many parents, many Catholic parents, don't want to be bothered with the dirtiness of that growth in virtue. They try to avoid it at all costs. They try to block every competing interest out of their kids' consciousness. And they think that if they keep their kids ignorant of everything, that will make them good Catholics. But there's sort of an unwritten or unspoken message in that method of parenting, which I think the kids hear. And the message is, we're actually afraid of those things. We're afraid of those things. Those things are stronger than our religion. Those things are more satisfying than our religion. And I think the kids hear that unspoken message. That's why those things are so dangerous. They're so dangerous because they're truer and better and more satisfying. And that's why we have to be so careful to keep them all away. Because if you ever get a glimpse, you'll just be lost. And that's false. That's false. I think it's laziness on the part of parents, not wanting to actually help their kids grow and work through those challenging questions and curiosities. I think it's lazy. I think it's also cowardly. I think that parents are more concerned about what their friends at church are going to think or say about them than what's actually best for their children. I think it's cowardly. And in the end, we often find those kids running into all kinds of problems, getting into all kinds of trouble. And then the parents just sort of shrug it off and say, oh, well, they left the faith. But they were never prepared to keep the faith. They weren't actually helped to grow. And this growth in virtue comes through the choices and decisions that the kids make in their freedom, which we have to be careful not to exaggerate and turn into terrible monsters. It's normal. It's normal for people with free will to want to go out and ask questions a little bit, to experience things, to see things for themselves, to test things for themselves, to take a test drive of a car dad doesn't like. That's part of what it means to be human, to have free will, and to want to make choices for oneself. And as parents, I think we actually need to respect that. And if we understand the faith truly, if we understand the Catholic life truly, if we understand the world and all that it offers to us, all the carnal desires that it offers to us, if we understand them all, we will know that none of them are satisfying. And they're not to be feared. And while we may want to advise our kids to stay away from certain things, and I think there are some things that are more serious than others, we also have to realize, like David's father, that it's good to get into the fight and scrap a little bit. It's good. It builds virtue. It develops a settled assurance in what one believes. And in the long run, that's my ultimate desire for my kids. Not just that they embrace and practice the Catholic faith, but that they do so with a resolution that allows them to actually live well as Catholics and fulfill the role of the laity if they choose to live in the lay state, to influence temporal affairs according to God's will, not just to be these lazy, wimpy Catholics who just go get jobs and just do whatever society is doing and imagine that because they talk about religion on the internet after work, they're some kind of heroic missionaries. I want kids who are really willing to undertake the solution of real-world problems out of love for their neighbor, with courageous spirits like David did when he was willing to step up and fight Goliath. And that's not going to come unless our kids learn to fight with these real enemies and overcome them. So, as a follow-up to that last talk on religious freedom and family religion, I hope this helps a little bit to bring it down to earth and make it even more practical. And I want to encourage parents to not overreact to decisions that kids make in American society when they reach the age of independence, to not overreact, but just to continue to model the Catholic life, continue to talk with the kids, discuss things with the kids, get after the truth with the kids, pursue things, spend more time asking questions than trying to lecture, because, you're not Aristotle. No one trusts that you have all the answers. It's better for you to lead the children to answer their own questions rather than pretend that you're the world's lecturer. But be patient. Don't worry about what others say or think. You should worry about your relationship with your children and do all that you can. Pray for them constantly and work to help them as they go through this process of examining all things and clinging to what's good. May God bless them and all of our children and help them to learn and cling to Catholicism. God bless.